Welcome to the Ask Rev Lee show. We're so happy and delighted that you could join us, and we thank you for doing so. Again, let me say, welcome to the Ask Rev Lee Gospel program. This is a religious forum program designed to help others get closer to God. I'm your host, Evangelist Lee McLean, and do we have an interesting, exciting, and attractive program planned for you today? This is a question and answer session. We read a passage of Scripture, develop a question from the Scripture, and then use other parts of the Bible, particularly the New Testament, to explain the meaning of what has been read. And I got an exciting question for you that goes to the heart of the gospel. This episode is entitled Peace and Love, Part 1, and Jesus the Christ, He is our peace. But in today's episode, we're going to be looking into how God achieved that peace for us through Him, through His Son, Jesus Christ. This will be an exciting program especially for Christians, born-again believers, because we're going to share with you how to attain the peace and tranquility, the peace and love that God has planned for you. Now, as usual, we will read a passage of Scripture, and then we'll have a word of prayer, and then we'll go into a discussion of today's question and answer. This is going to be a two-part show, part 1 and part 2. After about a half an hour, we'll take a break and change over to the second part of the show, of peace and love. First part is peace, second part is going to be love. Now, I'm going to turn to Romans chapter 5, verses 8 through 10. And I'm going to go to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 13 through 15. And the combination of those two passages of Scripture, what God has done and what mankind must do, will equate to peace and love. And let me say this. It is only the combination of these two passages of Scriptures that was written by the Apostle Paul, or a similar combination of Scriptures written by the Apostle John, the Apostle Peter, the writer to the Hebrews. Only a combination of these two passages of Scripture will give you the peace and tranquility that God has planned for you. Any other combination, and you are still an enemy underneath the wrath of God. I'm going to Romans chapter 5, verses 8 through 10. Then I'm going to skip over to 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verses 13 to 15. And those two passages of Scripture's combination equate to peace and love forever. Now, let me turn to Romans chapter 5, verses 8 to 10. And I might throw in 11, because 11, I'll say that 11 when I get to it. Romans chapter 5, verses 8 through 11. Let me say this. Excuse me. Everyone born of a woman, everyone that is born into this earth, and the only way for a human being to be born into this world is to be born of a woman. That's the only way. I don't know any other way. Heaven help this world when we get deep into same-sex marriages. They cannot procreate. Only lust and pleasure. Oh, what some pleasure. Now, Romans chapter 8, chapter 5, verses 8, assumes, makes the declaration, states that the whole world was under sin ever since Adam, from Adam to the coming of Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus the Christ of Nazareth. The whole world was under sin, Jews and Gentiles, descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and pagans. They were all under sin and condemnation by God. And Romans chapter 5, verses 8 tells us what God did for us. And it reads as follows. But God commended his love towards us, in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us on the cross. I know you heard about Jerusalem. He died on the cross. And he was buried. And 3 days later, he rose from the dead of his own accord. So verse 9 tells us about that resurrection. Verse 9, much more then, being now justified by his blood, we shall be saved from wrath through him, through Jesus Christ. We were justified through his blood, mean the shedding of the blood mean the taking of a life. And Jesus giving up his life, his earthly existence on the cross, was symbolic of him giving up his life for you and for me and for all humanity throughout all ages, past, present, and future. His blood put away sin, put away God's wrath against sin flowing from Adam forever. So at one point in time, this world was perfect and holy because God was satisfied. The blood, the death of Jesus Christ satisfied God's justice and vindicated his holiness. So he was at peace with the world. And then Jesus got up from the grave. Now let me say this. I don't know whether you've heard it before, but this is a faithful and true saying, and it is worthy of your acceptance, your learning, your knowledge, and your understanding. When Jesus of Nazareth got up out of the grave, he also got up with a new sin and a new way of salvation. Ask your pastor, didn't he get up with a new way of acceptance before God and a new sin? And it is this New Testament sin, this sin that Jesus got up from the grave with, that you have to worry about. Now, that's verse 9. He's up from the grave. Look at verse 10, and it tells us why, or the underlying motivation. For, the reason why, because, for, if when we were enemies, before Jesus died, we were God's enemies. For if when we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son,